Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday morning, April 29th. Today we're going to be finishing our study on the Beatitudes of Jesus. So we're going to be in Matthew 5, verses 10 through 12. It's one of the largest Beatitudes as far as verses are concerned, and it's the finishing of the part of Jesus' sermon. It still blows my mind. This is how he started his message. So I trust that this will continue to challenge you and help you to think through how your attitudes are challenged by Christ. Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when you are reviled and persecuted you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Verses 11 and 12 tie in with verse 10, so I'm going to spend most of my time on verse 10 and then tie in verse 11 and 12 at the end. So verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted. What does persecuted mean? It means to be mocked, ridiculed, criticized, ostracized, or to be treated with hostility. And we've all been persecuted in one way or shape or form, mostly through public school or even private school with bullies, kids on the playground, people, kids in the sports league, parents in the sports league. So we've all can experience that. But Jesus isn't talking about that type of persecution. What he's talking about is persecution, being mocked or ridiculed because of him, because of the gospel. Now, what are the ways that Jesus lays out in these verses that I read that we receive persecution? The first one is that we receive it physically, where we are physically harmed. And if you think about that, it ties in really well with our study that we're doing on Wednesday nights in the book of James, that the early church is being physically persecuted, they're being physically harmed, and even killed in some instances. The second way Jesus lays out persecution is verbally, by what people say to our face and how they make fun of us and how they mock us. The third way he lays out in verse 11, the second part of verse 11, is behind our back, where people talk about us and we can't be there to defend us. So he talks about physically, verbally, and then behind our back. And that the one behind our back, that hurts because we can't even defend ourselves because we don't know what's being said. So Jesus lays out those three areas of persecution. But then look at what he says in verse 10. He says, blessed are those. And then he says again in verse 11, blessed are you. And so he says blessed twice. It's a double blessing. And so really what he's saying is doubly blessed are those that receive or endure persecution because of the name of Jesus. And I just want you to stop and think about that. We live in America and we really don't understand persecution physically that our friends and churches and other countries face, but we sometimes face persecution verbally, especially if you're in the public school system and you make a stand. You can really commiserate and understand and empathize with what Jesus says, because that hurts, especially being a teenager and having those words said, and it hurts. And so he says here, blessed are those, you're going to be doubly blessed because you face persecution for Jesus' name. But why would people persecute us? Well, they're going to persecute for three different reasons. The first one is we speak truth and we speak righteousness. The eighth beatitude lines up with the first seven we've talked about from verse 3 through verse 9. And if we practice all of these attitudes, our hearts are going to start to change. And when our hearts change, then our hands change. And as our hands change, we become different, and we become different than the world, and people make fun of different. We're not called to be weird, we're called to be different. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 17 is a great cross reference if you want to read that. So we're called to be different, not called to be weird. So if we practice these, we are going to speak truth, we're going to speak in when things are wrong, and we're going to stand up for things that are right, and people may mock us for that. They may persecute for us for that. We also can receive persecution when we speak for Christ and we share the gospel. The gospel is not something the world is going to come into and accept. And so when they reject it, they not only reject us, they reject Christ, and then they start to persecute, they start to make fun of us. If you think back to when the Bible was written by these authors, they received physical threats, and most of them died because they stood up for the gospel. So that can happen here. Most of the time in America, it's verbally, not physically. So the third way is that when we're faithful to the Lord, when we follow these attitudes that Christ has called us to, we can receive persecution. We can receive the backlash because we're not going to gossip. We're not going to participate in the crude jokes. We may walk away, and we may be the only one in the break room or in the other room that is not participating, and people could make fun of us for that. So we receive persecution because we speak the truth and stand up for righteousness. We speak for Christ and the gospel, or we're faithful to the Lord and practicing verses 3-9. When we are persecuted for Christ, we will be receiving the kingdom of heaven. Now, this does not mean we can earn salvation, but I just want you to think about something that you stand up for. And when you stand up for something, that means that you're wholeheartedly behind it and you're willing to pay the price to stand up for what you believe in. And you really don't stand up for things that you believe in that you're not wholeheartedly into, and something that you wholeheartedly endorse. Think about something that you are willing to die for. I've said it in the service when we had services. I've even said it live. I've said it on recordings that when there's different viewpoints and it doesn't really, if you will, make a difference. I say, hey, this is what this person says. This is what this person says. This is what I think, but I'm not willing to build a church on it. I'm willing to buy a cup of coffee. I've said that before, especially during our service. But then there's been times where I said, this is the gospel truth. And I'm willing to take a stand on this, and I'm willing to buckle down, and I'm not willing to move. That is what Jesus is saying here. Blessed are those who are persecuted, who are saying, I'm going to take a stand for the gospel. I'm going to take a stand for Jesus. I'm going to take a stand for what he has said, and I'm going to make these changes in my life. Then you will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Not because you took a stand, but because you believe in Jesus and are willing to go all in and follow Christ. And when you're willing to go in and follow Christ, that means that you believe in him. And you can see the fruit of your attitude in the hands in the way they work. And so again, we see that the attitude takes place in our hearts, but then we see that attitude work out in our hands. And so the blessing is that we inherit an eternity with Christ, not because we suffered persecution, but because the willingness to suffer because we believe in Jesus's words and are willing to follow him, not just in the easy times, but in the difficult times. And so I trust that this study in the Beatitudes of Jesus in Matthew 5 has been encouraging to you. I trust that it has been one that has helped you grow in your relationship with the Lord. And tomorrow I'm coming out with a devotional on Tom's Thursday Thoughts. So I'll be back live on Friday as we start a new study. And don't forget, tonight is our Bible study in the book of James, chapter 1, verses 12-20. So if you are able to join us at 6:30, we'll be here for 20 minutes, half hour, and we'll continue to study the book of James that helps us as Christians work through the persecution and still continue to love Christ as he draws us closer. If I can help you anyway, I trust you'll reach out and you'll continue to grow in your relationship